Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by EyePatchNotes. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about the Witch of Contradiction series. This is 3.4, a Chapter 3 review. I'd just like to say a little note before we begin. I think that some people who might enjoy this series might get overly caught up on the exact details or like the numerousness of the mechanics. I think EyePatchNotes are interested in those specific mechanics for a variety of reasons, and maybe I'll try to talk about that more this time. But I would like to say that I could also imagine somebody enjoying this series for another reason that I'm enjoying it, which is that it's kind of a look into how somebody would enjoy a system like this. There are a couple of examples in this one specifically that I noticed where it's like you can see how there being a lot of math in the Mathcraft. The Mathfinder, could be fun to someone. And from the outside, I see myself not being very interested in the system. You know what I mean? Like having played 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons, of which, not 5th edition, but Dungeons and Dragons created kind of an offshoot that is Pathfinder. They didn't create it, it was created. Pathfinder is, to me, from the outside, kind of D&D with more math, which that I don't know. Don't, it would be my response. But having seen a window into how someone is enjoying this kind of system, I feel like I'm uniquely better able to appreciate, no, it is in the name of fun. All the numerage, the Mathfinder, is in the name of something potentially fun, in a way that I think games like this are potentially uniquely badly suited to make clear to the audience on the outside. So perhaps it would be interesting for you, dear listener, to come along for a minute and listen to just the ambiance of the Mathfinder. I am going to try to continue to understand the sort of core mechanical things, but I think you could enjoy these Parley without that. I just wanted to plug because I think these are pretty interesting, but it made me think, but why? You know what I mean? To some extent, these Parley are a lot of work, to be upfront. This is one of the harder Parley series because it's so mechanical. It's quite dense too. But anyway, that having said that, there's a lot to get through. I just thought it was worth a little premise at the beginning. I legitimately think it's quite interesting to consider the audience perspective on a series like this that is like, you want to tell me these things, EyePatchNotes. Like, to some extent, I understand that that's what it is, and you want to enumerate them the way you have them in mind. That makes sense. It's an interesting, fairly common reason people make Parley. I just thought it was interesting in this particular case how it could be seen from the outside. I just thought that was cool. I hope that's okay. That being said, this is also a good one for it because it is kind of a recap, a review, a high-level view. If you're new to these, this might be a decent entry point too. EyePatchNotes begins. Roadmaps. Who makes roadmaps? I'm looking to curtain the previous Witch of Contradiction methodology and start using human-readable titles. Vaguely, Chapter 1, Pathfinder Class Structure. Chapter 2, Pathfinder Animal Companions / Familiars. Chapter 3, You Are Here. Pathfinder Damage Progression. Chapter 4, Pathfinder Action Economy, and Chapter 5, Pathfinder Equipment? ? And those are roughly the ones we've done. Indeed, the sort of Chapter 1 Witch of Contradiction series Parley have been about class structure. The Chapter 2 ones have been about Animal Companions, Familiars. It's been pretty organized. You just didn't name them that way to start with. Yeah, fair enough. For the summary of this April Parley. Pathfinder marshals are measured on a scale from 0 to 20 marshal score. Extra attacks are benchmarked at marshal score +6, +11, and +16. If you're from 5th edition D&D, what's going on here is that you get the extra attack feature once you have a total of 6 marshal score. 11 marshal score, you get another one. 16, you get a third one. In 5th edition D&D, you need to be 5 levels into a single class that can get extra attack to get it. Kind of unbalanced because cantrips increase their damage when you are total character level 5, 11, whatever, regardless of what levels those levels are in, which makes marshals even more on the back foot for no clear reason. This is a way that Pathfinder kind of changes that. Pretty cool, fairly obvious, I guess, but it's a good solution in my opinion. Animal companions have relatively poor martial score but high base stats. Familiars can have high martial score at the cost of poor base stats. Eldritch Guardian fighters lock in high martial score. Mauler familiars, it's a familiar feat, fix their base strength. Druids are casters first, martials second. Rangers are martials first, casters second. Animal companions are powerful martial assets to both druids and rangers. Familiars are not powerful when owned by wizards and witches, but familiars can be powerful if the player jumps through some hoops, and thus the Witch of Contradiction we're building up to is barely a witch. We will begin with the sort of sidebar. There's a major or minor discrepancy with how EyePatchNotes describe animal companion scaling that I chose to leave alone, but will bring up now. I use 0.6 martial score per level because it is smooth and human readable. However, the reality is that where players are clamped from 0 to 20, animal companions are clamped from 1 to 12. Animal companions start with a leg up before the 0.6 per level scaling becomes more or less true. They are more accurate than they should be at first, second, and third level. I gather that you mean that they start with a little bit of martial score, but they can only get so high, unlike players which start with none and go up to more. Usually the exact martial score is moot, since what the game checks for is total of accuracy bonuses, martial score plus your relevant stat bonus, strength or dexterity, usually strength for a non-finesse melee. The main reason to check martial score is feat prerequisites, and that is the bottleneck for animal companions. Oh, I see the problem. Okay, for Byzantine reasons, animal companions learn their first martial score plus 6 feet at 10th level, later than even 3/4 martials like rogues and druids. No realistic amount of base stats will make up for delaying some of the system's most powerful feats, a topic for a few months from now. Sure, yeah, but this is a revelation to me. So if your pet is scaling stats alongside you, but its martial score is low, jumping to the table for a minute, you can see that there, you could get some decent stats on your giant dragonfly or what have you, right? You can get to the point where they have pretty good strength and dexterity, almost like they were a full character, but the difference is that their martial score is a lot lower than a player's would be. So while they may have the stats of like a full fighter, a full rogue, they do not have the features of a full fighter or full rogue, which is a lot of where their damage is coming from. We will be coming back to this later, but the Eldritch Guardian's bat with the Mauler feat that we're going to talk about actually does have a pretty high martial score at the expense of the stats are pretty bad. The stats of like a level 1 character at level 10, but the martial score, it's not bad. And so perhaps this is where this is eventually going. If you're gonna get your accuracy from martial score and or strength or dexterity, getting it from martial score seems kind of better because you also get feat prerequisite stuff. Now the total for the familiar is kind of sussy, and we'll talk about that later, but getting it from martial score is definitely somewhat of a compensation, potentially pretty powerful. Cool. Some feats in Pathfinder fall into categories, most commonly combat or none/general. Yeah, they have tags. This is such a good feature. Bonus feats from combat features are usually one of or more named feats. For example, rogues are granted weapon finesse at first level, but other classes could get it, but rogues get it by name. Or the player's choice of a feat from an appropriate category. Yes, this is the vaunted modularity of Pathfinder that we talked about quite early in the series. Really cool, just a very sensible way to do it. If you're going to give rogues a class identity that revolves around having certain abilities that are present in the game overall, why not just give rogues the way that the thing is present elsewhere in the system? Great. Or you can get the player's choice of a feat in an appropriate category. Other tags include the 5th edition like metamagic line to influence spells with different effects, which are sliced into individual class agnostic feats in Pathfinder. Oh, is there no class that specializes in metamagic? That seems kind of smart, maybe. Item creation is a feat tag. Interesting. Teamwork feats. Powerful feats that require at least 2 players or familiars/animal companions to all have the feat. Hint, hint. Vanilla fighters gain 7 bonus feats up through 12th level. These are purely wildcard player-chosen feats. They just have to be combat feats. Eldritch Guardian fighters, the subclass of fighter, Eldritch Guardian, pays 2 bonus feats to get a familiar and teach it combat feats. So it can be said that Eldritch Guardians have a net value of 10 combat feats, since the remaining 5 feats are present on 2 bodies. So what's going on here is that you would normally get, as a fighter, 7 extra feats. Eldritch Guardian fighters lose 2, down to 5, but all their combat feats are mirrored to their familiar, so plus 5. I think I just completely yucked up the math. 7 minus 2, which is 5, but then the familiar duplicates those 5 if they're combat feats, which is 10. So the Eldritch Guardian fighter, in a way, gets more feats. It would just have to be things that are useful for both. Players still have to mind that what is good for the goose is not necessarily applicable to the gander, and vice versa. I use this example verbally. Here's the first party text. Share training. At second level, when the familiar can see and hear its master, it can use any combat feat possessed by the Eldritch Guardian. The familiar doesn't have to meet the feat's prerequisites, but at the game master's discretion may be precluded from using certain combat feats due to its physical form. For example, an Eldritch Guardian's pig familiar, with access to exotic weapon proficiency, spiked chain, would not get the ability to use spiked chains, since it doesn't have any limbs capable of properly handling them. This ability replaces the bonus feat granted at second level to the fighter class, normally. Cool. Yeah, I'm delighted by the whimsical example from the really just hitting you over the head with, like, yeah, you can't have your pig use a flail. Like, I got that rules text, thank you. But, I mean, it's a good example. Yes, and so this is where we're going. The idea that you copy, sort of, the feats from the Eldritch Guardian. You don't get 10 feats, but you could potentially be adding the value of 10 feats to your build overall, provided they're all things that your companion can actually use. And again, note that in many cases that actually is really restrictive. The pig's example seems kind of but if you think about it, it's like, well, if your familiar flies, how many small creatures that you can get as a familiar, I guess I don't actually know this, can wield a weapon, for example? You know what I mean? So it would be easy from the outside to think like, oh, just get 10 feats worth of value. It's like, well, you probably will need to pick a good amount of things that are a little less powerful for a humanoid, because your, raven or whatever can't, use a shuriken or something. Maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I might give that the okay as your game master if your raven passes a ludicrous dexterity related check, but they probably won't, because as we talked about before, they have really bad anyway, whatever. We'll come back to it later. I will also confess to cherry picking the giant dragonfly from before to compare with the mauler bat, because they are both medium-sized flyers with a 2d6 bite. Perhaps unsurprisingly, both specimens are on the lower end of Mathfinder's total spectrum. There are more powerful animal companions like dinosaurs, and more martial familiars like the house cat that has 2 claws in addition to a bite. A medium house cat can engage in the animal equivalent of 2-weapon fighting, and all that implies damage. A lot of damage is what that implies. So again, a quick example of, you can still use things that require weapons without the familiar being able to use a weapon. In my example before, maybe your raven can't throw a volley of shurikens from its talons, or maybe it can. Talk to your game master. But I would imagine that you could still count it as 2-weapon fighting, one with each claw, if the cat gets the count as that, and potentially their mouth could be a useful weapon. Humanoids, I think it's fair to say, without an absolutely preposterous amount of training, even then, cannot usually use their face as a valid martial weapon. But cats or most animals, yeah, man, that's what they do. A wolf, I feel like its mouth is more of a martial weapon than its claws. So yeah, I would say it totally checks out. It's definitely cat's claws are 1-2 martial weapons for sure. Maybe not much damage, but go figure. Bats do have one trick up their sleeve though, and this is key to the rest of the parlay. A 1d4 bite is anomalous at medium 3, which is diminutive size. It's weird. It shouldn't be like that. It should not deal that much damage at that size, as there are medium 1 small familiars that deal the same 1d4. The result is that the Mauler's size compensation can spring the bat to a greatsword-like 2d6 bite with further support, more than other Mauler familiars can boast with the same investment. I take this typo or oversight or why ever the bat has too high damage. and run with it to pen the Witch of Contradiction, whose second contradiction leans heavily on the greatsword levels of damage coming from a second martial body that is a large bat. Other familiars can fly, other familiars have respectable base damage, but only the bat does both. Unfortunately, the bat also has a base strength of 1, the worst possible other than 0. This makes Mauler bats a hard sell without shenanigans. Shenanigans happening to be my specialty / brand. Pathfinder's charm for me is finding these kinds of relationships and trade-offs. I think I jumped the gun on the graphic, but the idea is that, as you can see, the bat has absolutely atrocious stats. At second level, it has strength of 1, which is -5 to hit. Remember, if you're not as familiar with these games mathematically, or you just play a lot of 5th edition or whatever, but you never see really low scores, because that's not how most people run it. I do, actually, but that when you are below 10 in an ability score, you lose points. If you're totally unfamiliar with this system, it basically hinges around 10. 10 is average, you get no bonus. 0 is sort of the full negative, you get -5. And 20 is the full positive, you get +5. A little esoteric, but every 2 points around 10 gives you +1 or -1 to your bonus. So 12 gives you +1, 14 gives you +2. By the same token, 6 gives you -2. And so, although the bat does all this wonderful stuff with having like unusual scaling that we'll get into in a minute, it has absolutely atrocious stats to begin with. This can be fixed, is fixed eventually. You can see that it quickly catches back up, and we will talk about that a little more later. But the idea is that while there is a cost, there are some unique factors here that can be taken advantage of. Like we were saying before, the size, we'll kind of get back to it, but then the martial score, these are things that if you were going to trade away something, trading away the raw strength stat, but then you get the martial score still, it's not a bad trade. You can kind of profit on that, which is sort of what we're going to be doing. Okay, enough of the summary part. Let's go to the second part of the text. So we've set the stage. There is a way in which you can have your bat kind of scale in a way that other companions don't. And there are various advantages to it scaling well with these things, but poorly with these things. If you're going to have something get thrown by the wayside, strength, dexterity, raw stats are in some ways not a bad thing to have be thrown by the wayside. To some degree, that helps play to the familiar's strengths a little better. They still get relatively okay martial score. They can still scale their damage with the size increase thing from previous Parley that we're going to talk about today. Recap from a few months ago, 5th edition has a proficiency bonus representing training as you level up, clamped from 2 to 6, and extra attack is a named class feature only granted to specific classes, as I discussed before. Pathfinder instead has a martial score that goes the full spectrum of 0 to 20 based on how weapon-minded a class tends to be. So when you take a level in a class, you get a certain amount of martial points you add to your martial score based on how weapony that class is. Something like a fighter would be 1 point. Something like a wizard would be 0.5 points. You get the idea. All classes, including squishy wizards, get extra attacks once their martial score reaches +6, +11, and +16. Well, if it ever reaches those values. These prerequisites are echoed by the 2-weapon fighting line, adding a 4th attack at martial score +6 and a 6th attack at +11, should the character take the feats at least. For another recap, one of the core differences between familiars and druid-like animal companions is martial score inheritance. Regardless of source, familiars mimic their master's martial score, whether the wizard, 0.5 per level, or ranger, 1 per level. Animal companions gain 0.6 martial score per level, no matter what, meaning they only reach 11 at the equivalent of 18th level, way beyond the mortal ken of most tables. Right, like most people don't play till 18th level. Third recap, the Eldritch Guardian subclass for fighters doubles down on this martial score inheritance with feat inheritance. Vanilla fighters receive a bonus feat with the combat tag at first level, and every even level thereafter, 2, 4, etc. The Eldritch Guardian gives up their first 2 bonus feats at level 1 and 2, to gain A, a familiar, not normally part of the fighter identity, and B, a class feature that reads, grant all of the character's combat familiars to the familiar, feats to the familiar, including ignoring martial score and other prerequisites. It's extremely difficult to read all of this in one take. Starting from Fighter 4, the familiar will aggressively learn new feats to fight alongside their master. as long as the master makes sure to take feats that can be used by a thumbless animal. I purposefully wanted to read the other summary of this and then this to help it land more easily for some of the audience, but also for me. We have a pop quiz section. The Mauler subclass for familiars, it's a subclass, not a feat, adjust the familiar's size to medium, no matter the original size. Most familiars are sized at medium 2, tiny, or medium 3, diminutive. Using size progression, what is the new damage of a diminutive Mauler that starts with a 1d4 damage bite? This I like understood but didn't understand, and now I do understand it, so I'm going to explain it to you because it's fun to learn things by teaching them. So what's going on here is because the Mauler subclass adjusts the companion size to medium no matter where they are. You can think of it like a scale. If medium is here, let's say medium is like a 0 as a size bonus, and you have like let's say the medium 2 tiny, medium 3 diminutive completely utterly destroys my brain because medium 3 bigger number, smaller creature. Diminutive, that sounds smaller. Tiny versus diminutive, that's kind of up for debate. Medium 1 is small. Medium 3 is diminutive. Okay, small and then diminutive is smaller, I get that. But medium 3 is a bigger number. I hate that. But anyway, whatever. It's like medium -3, right? And so let's say medium 0, just medium, right? Medium -1 is small, medium -2 is tiny, medium -3 is diminutive. And that's where our bat is going to start. So if our bat starts at 1d4 and they are diminutive, 3 notches back, no matter where they are on this scale, they go to here when they take the Mauler subclass, but they still move up that many notches on the size scale, and every time you move up, you increase your damage die. 1d4, 1d6, 1d8, then there's a jump and you go to 2d6, etc., like that. And so the idea here is that if you are smaller, the smaller you are, the better Mauler is, because you jump up like more size categories for free. But also, the higher your damage die starts, the better it is to jump up a lot of size categories, because you move your damage die up the dice chain once every time. The bat is a combination, as we talked about before, of 1d4, not terrible starting die for a small creature, but then also it's really small. It's really far down the scale. It gains a lot of notches up, a lot of die increases, but also a relatively high starting die. And so we'll go 1d4, 1d6, 1d8, and then 2d6. A greatsword. From having a little dagger of a bite, the Mauler subclass jumps it all the way up to being a greatsword's worth of damage. And I'll reveal the spoiler text just to check my work. It says 1d4 to 1d6, it's now tiny, 1d8, it's now small, and then up to 2d6, it's now medium, Mauler subclass. Note the double step after 1d8. Yep, talked about it a lot in a lot of previous Parley, but this makes it way easier to understand. No criticism at all, EyePatchNotes, but I'll tell you, I would have understood it better seeing this type of example first, I suspect. I think something about using it in a build in practice helped. Like, I really, some of the way it's worded in the game, not by you, just deeply frustrates me, but I'm much more able to latch onto this. I feel like I understand and could make use of this system myself now. Right, so we get to be blunt, enormous damage bonus from the Mauler subclass for companions. The bat goes from being a plinky dagger to being like the highest, terrestrial martial damage there is, just by om-nom-nomming on something. Let's look at the table. And so you can see at the bottom, we have the kind of bite damage example just below me. It says 1d4 when you start, but then if you give it the Mauler subclass, I guess that's what that assumes, you can see it goes up to 2d6. Now, the dragonfly, well, it started at medium 1 with 1d8, and the Mauler subclass still only corrected it to 2d6. It had less notches to jump up, and it started with an accordingly higher die, and thus it doesn't benefit as much, is my understanding, but that might just be completely wrong. I don't know. And we'll come back to more of this table in a minute, because we need to do some abstract build theory. Mathfinder druids are 3/4 martials, that's strange, 0.75 score per level, and also full casters up to 9th level spells on the fastest track. Druids are packaged with animal companions by default, but can make other classes or other class or subclass decisions to remove their companion. If we assume the druids spend their action economy on spells rather than martial activities, we can derive a player score of 1.6. The idea is that you have a caster score of 1.0 because you have full spell slot progression, and then a companion score of 0.6. Thus, the character's total value of player points brought to the table is 1.6. 1.0 for being a full caster and 0.6 from their companion, which gets 0.6 martial score, which if they were a martial character would be like 0.6 worth of a martial character. Cool. Rangers, being half casters, only spells up to 4th level, 0.5 score per level, and full martials with an animal companion have an adjacent player score of 1.6 when counting only martial ability. Here we ignore the fact that they technically have 0.5 spells because they're probably going to be using their actions to do martial stuff, at which they are doing 1.0 levels of power, and then they have a 0.6 martial score companion, so another total of 1.6. Here we can kind of score the build overall by summing up the actions it's expected to take and looking at that versus what you would expect a character specializing in such a thing to do. This will break down if you were to make like a highly hybrid character. You're imagining a character like Rangers. I had like a minor quibble that it doesn't really matter for this example, where if you do Hunter's Mark or something as a bonus action and then you shoot as an action, I feel like you're getting a bit more than 1.0 value from that. You get to benefit from the magic a little, like a decent amount, while doing, your extra attack or whatever. But let's not worry about it too much for now. Just note, if you find this a distasteful oversimplification, EyePatchNotes and I are both well aware that this is not suitable to like fully evaluate all builds. It's just a way to think about the subject. These are abstracted values with which to macro compare classes, underlining the power of a second player controlled body. It's like having half or more of a character. Rogues are solitary bodies with only 3/4 martial progression that still float near the top of the damage charts because action economy is the real vibe check, and we'll get there in part 4. Extending the conversation to witches and wizards, they are full casters and half martials, 0.5 martial score per level. Familiars mirror their master's martial score and thus are basically half martials in this case. However, a half-size, half-martial body can hardly be factored into the player character's overall combat potential, reducing the player's score of a wizard or a witch to that of a caster level only 1.0, pretty much. Basically, the idea is that the small, like, yes, it's half martial score, but the familiar is usually also like really small, has lower base damage die or whatever, and so it doesn't fully count as being like an actual 0.5. As you can see, if you were to have like your giant dragonfly as a ranger, it absolutely has it basically just has the stats of a player character, but just with less martial score. In many ways, your bat not sized up with the Mauler subclass is in no way going to do like the same performance as, the giant dragonfly, right? You have to invest more in it to get it to do that. We can dive into the pool of madness anew, because having a light episode, please, we're not going to get into that. This is the Witch of Contradiction series, by fishing back Eldritch Guardian support. Fighters are true martials with bonus combat feats to prove it, and Mauler subclass familiars follow suit. They gain the full martial scale progression. Ergo, a player score of 2.0 derived from 2 full-fat player-sized martial bodies. You may find yourself asking, what do fighters have to do with witches? And thus we finally unearthed the first contradiction, that the Witch of Contradiction is going to be an Eldritch Guardian fighter with only 1 witch level. Yes, this had become clear from 2 or 3 of these ago, where we had this analysis of the relative martial level between certain multi-class combinations, which this is kind of a payoff for. The idea being that because we found a way to get a familiar that scales with the exact martial level of the master, with a class that gets full martial progression, we have a sort of 2.0 player total score, which is quite a bit above the curve. You could say that just on the face, it seems to me like that means Eldritch Guardian fighters are just somewhat overpowered. all this discussion aside, it seems like this is a slightly busted subclass for fighters, because they get well above the power curve worth of value. It would have to be that those pieces of value were much more janky to make use of. We talked before about, of course, your companion is maybe going to be a little bit difficult to get value out of, but all these other examples were getting their player score above 1.0 with a companion. Usually that was locked at 0.6 martial score. So it seems pretty fair to compare to, oh, well, we have a familiar, a companion. Yeah, there's some jank to getting combat value out of the familiar, but not, I hope not that different than an animal companion. And its martial score is higher. You can see that it to some degree evens out. Like, obviously we're using the numbers as a way to kind of guesstimate here. And at 10th level, you can see that the overall bonus between the two is kind of the same. So it starts out, and the giant dragonfly is pretty far ahead. If they're attacking with strength, then it's got a martial score of +2. And I think they just start at that. It sounded like they get a little boost at the beginning. And then strength of 13, so +1. So they have +3 to hit. The bat does not yet have, I assume the diminutive size to start off with means the animal companion sizes up naturally, and the bat doesn't get the mauler subclass until 4th level. I'm not sure if that's how that works, but that seems to be how it works. And so the bat starts off with a +2 -5 for -3 to hit. Considerably worse accuracy than the giant dragonfly. It's like practically guaranteed to miss enemies with decent armor class. But then at 4th level, you can see it catching up very quickly. The Mauler subclass has adjusted the strength to be neutral, so suddenly the bat jumped from -3 to +4, 0 from strength now, and +4 from the martial score. While the dragonfly went from +3 to +7, still a pretty good gain, but by comparison, the relative increase in the bat's effectiveness is much larger. Then at 10th level, the bat has about caught up. You can see the martial score for the giant dragonfly is increasing slowly, and so with only +6, strength of 20, very good, but that's only +5. We've got 11, and the bat has caught up. Martial score of 10, much higher, because it scales with the Eldritch Guardian's full martial score. And then the strength is only 13 for +1, but you can see that if this continues, and especially if the ability score bonus part caps at 20 like it does in 5th edition. I'm just assuming there's some cap to ability scores. The bat seems like it will overtake the animal companion with potentially not like a huge further amount of investment. You can see there's another kind of weird equivalence. There are benefits maybe to the animal companion, unique features like flyby attack, which in 5th edition lets you like attack and then leave range without getting opportunity attacked because you fly, you drive by the enemy with your wings. I don't know. It's kind of hard to imagine a dragonfly doing that, but whatever. And then 3 player chosen feats. The companions just get them as they leveled. But you can see that because we get combat feats for the bat, if we take Eldritch Guardian feats, fighter feats that apply to the bat, we can catch up to that. So you said it was every even numbered levels. So we lost 2 of them. So it's 4, 6, 8, and 10. So already I think we've gotten the chance for 4 fighter feats. So feats with a combat tag. If the bat can use most or all of them, then the bat also kind of comes out ahead in terms of utility, provided there's nothing really good that you like couldn't have used on the bat, but the animal companion can do some utility thing which that's probably true. They probably have different utility. But from a purely combat perspective, the bat has largely caught up while having the potential to improve. I think a kind of sidebar that we probably don't really have time in this particular parlay, but it just, and the thing you said about it before sort of stuck in my brain, that most tables, people playing these games, don't actually go all the way up the level chart, has created this interesting dynamic. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Basically, the idea is that if they've caught up by this point, well, but that's 10th level. A lot of tables don't go well beyond 10th, 11th, 12th level. I've seen players many times insist that it's not actually possible to run like 5th edition's combat beyond 5th or 6th at the most level. Now, never mind that I and plenty of other people have. Like, that's just obviously wrong in a certain way. they're trying to say, I don't want to feel like I failed for running this way too open-ended, badly balanced combat. Yeah, you shouldn't feel bad about that. I don't feel. But that it's not like you can't do it. That is truly a topic for another time. But just to say that it is a very common perception. Like I've hardly ever met anyone who didn't insist, although they were never willing to explain why. You just can't. You can't even play beyond 12th level or whatever. Interestingly, Baldur's Gate 3, which adapts 5th edition's combat quite closely, stops at 12th level, and so what that means is that you don't yeah. And a lot of the reason for that is that many of the class features at very high levels, especially spells, become, well, kind of unmanageable. If you're level, I don't remember where Mirage Arcane is. There's like a 7th or 8th level spell that recreates an entire area of terrain for like 10 days or something. Like you can't, it's not easy to let the player do that in a digital game. I mean, they went pretty crazy with some of the stuff, but that's, voice acting all the animals is one thing. Letting the player have a level editor as just one spell, you have to implement an entire level editor, is kind of yeah. I mean, you could make them generic, but I feel like that would ruin a lot of the fun too. I don't know. And some of the spells, like the value is just too dependent on role playing. Like, why is it good to make it look like this area is a swamp? Like, that just requires too much emergent learning from the game. But the result is that we kind of get to see a world where your build caps out at a point which many players had kind of assumed naturally. When you talk about builds online for these games, you see people floating around like 10th or 12th level as a place where, like, that's as far as the build's really gonna get a lot of the time. 15th level, some people get greedy. It's not a set number, but a lot of the time people will wisely, I think, measure when the build gets online. You maybe 6th level or whatever. If you don't do that, you won't get to play the build because it won't like do the thing before the game is just over. And so an interesting question I'm going to have for this setup going forward is, to what degree does it feel like the Mauler bat has kind of come online, by a reasonable amount of time? You can see on this table that while at 10th level, we're in a pretty good spot, I would argue that's a bit late. I'm sure that's not particularly controversial. The fact that the bat will eventually scale way past the animal companion just doesn't matter that much most of the time. And so to some extent, I would say, yeah, we've about hit on par with the animal companion. But were anyone to claim that this is way better, because like at later levels, when you're definitely not going to be playing anymore, it goes way ahead. I don't know. It's more like you got to be a full martial character and give them a bunch of feat scaling that pays off like soon enough that it's equivalent to an animal companion. And there must be a twist in here somewhere. I don't know what the witch level is going to do anymore, but there will be some kind of iteration that wakes that up. It feels like you can see pretty early, actually, 4th level, you've already gotten like a pretty good payoff where the familiar is somewhat similar to having an animal companion from being a druid or a ranger. So I feel like that part largely checks out. I wanted to talk briefly before we end about the idea of a total player score, because this is something that I kind of think about a lot when I make builds in a lot of games, but didn't really, I didn't put it to so many words, I guess. The idea is that there's this pursuit in making builds of like maximizing something, of having the thing that's important to you, and then you kind of pursue it. I think in many ways that's a simple description of what making a build is. What is the process? What do? You pick the things that are important to you, and then you go get them, using the game systems to acquire them in some way. And I think people have a tendency to be interested in acquiring them in a way which like isn't completely obvious to them. There's a point at which you will feel like, well, it's easy enough to just get really good damage that I'm not really interested in, I don't prioritize that anymore. It's not that you'll want that and then just not bother to go get it because it's boring. It's more like you just won't want that thing. You likely won't make a build, the goal of which is to like straightforwardly achieve something very normal to achieve. Instead, this could be seen as a build that just kind of goes for the best value. It wants to get a good deal. That's kind of the way I think of the player score thing. The Eldritch Guardian fighter with their familiar is getting a good deal on total player score. But another way to look at it is that we're actually just maximizing the familiar in a way. We value something less conventional, less straightforward. And to maximize that thing is just less known than maximizing something like I'm going to get the most attacks or whatever on a turn. That might just be kind of rote, boring, obvious at this point. And so it's not so much that you would play the game as normal, you'd just do a lot of attacks like everyone else, but you'd be bored about maximizing that, making a character that didn't really do anything. Someone who wants to make a build is probably going to prioritize the thing that is just more interesting to them to maximize. But then the actual thing they do when they make the build, I would argue, is largely similar to the thing the other players are doing. Then what is the appeal or the merit of that, right? It basically is the same experience as maximizing the other thing. Well, a couple of things. The first one is that you have to do some shenanigans. It's just harder to maximize it. You need to use different things. You get to use different things. You get the variety of exploring this, that, and the other feature instead of the features that are obviously planted there to do that thing. You get to use features in ways that might not always have been apparent. There might be a feature that looked cool, but it's just not readily apparent what it will do in the game. It's just kind of there as something the developers figured players would want, but it's not as telegraphed what it would be good for. And then, I mean, there you go. You found a place for it. That's kind of fun. And it feels a little bit more like you've created something in a world rather than something the developers kind of scripted in, which is satisfying in a new way. The developers had your back in that they put this stuff in for you to use, intending it to be like balanced or interesting in some way, but not knowing exactly where it would be used or in what ways it would be used. And then you picked that up and found a place where not only did you have the ingenuity to like put it in a place where it's actually useful, the developers had the ingenuity to include it there for you to find. And you both get this moment not talking to each other, but connecting across the ether where you sort of cooperated without having actually coordinated at all. That's kind of cool. Your build then, when you play it, becomes kind of more about the journey that you went through, for me anyway. And it feels like, well, I enjoy that we got to this point, that this even exists is kind of exciting. The very fact that you have something I'm working on right now, a Magic the Gathering deck in Commander that does a lot of ramping. It accelerates its mana production a lot without having you shuffle. And a couple of these decks do it in a way that really isn't worse in any meaningful way than if you did it with the shuffling cards, but only because of a unique situation that the deck has put itself in. There's some unique aspect of the deck that means it's good to use the ramp spells that don't make you shuffle, therefore allowing you to have a smooth, shuffle-less gameplay experience. I just really hate shuffling, if you're not familiar with this odd obsession of mine, by the way. And my whole play, well, everybody, I think everybody hates shuffling. My whole playgroup hates shuffling. And so a lot of the decks are designed in a way where they have suitable mana acceleration, but they don't, it's not just that they avoid shuffling. It's that they're built in a way where they almost completely eliminate the disadvantage of not shuffling, of avoiding the good ramp spells that do require you to shuffle. These decks have a very specific condition about them, maybe a way they're constructed or their commander or whatever, that means that they lose very little from that in this unique situation. And that kind of thing is quite fun. I mean, those cards are in the game. It's not like I didn't like get one over on the developers. I didn't invent that idea as per se. The developers put cards in that do things like the shuffling cards, but that don't make you shuffle, in some cases quite explicitly to reduce shuffling. Like, not always very explicitly, but those cards are in there like so that it does the thing. Or I have one of the decks where the way the deck is getting the ramp that is kind of better than if you were to use cards that make you shuffle is by enchanting lands so that they tap for more mana. And the commander has a unique ability to untap enchanted permanents, like your lands, which then means they not only tap again, because you untap them, but they tap for more, because the reason they're enchanted, which is why you untap them, is that they tap for more mana when you tap them, thus giving you massive mana acceleration. They're more vulnerable. Players could destroy your enchantments, and then your land doesn't produce more mana anymore. but it won't destroy the land, and you get so much more mana than if you use normal mana acceleration. So a little bit of vulnerability, and you can get the payoff quite quickly. It's pretty hard to believe the players will just machine gun down all your enchantments before you ever get any mana out of them. Is pretty amazing. Having played this deck a few times, it's fantastic. It's both more interactable, and it has no shuffling. It takes less time, it's easier to interact with, and it's kind of better a lot of the time. Not all of the time, I don't care about that. That journey to get to that point, and the feeling like the developer sort of put that there for me to work with. Obviously, it says untap enchanted permanents because they're thinking, well, I mean, not just creatures, you can enchant lots of things. Wouldn't it be cool to enchant like lands and then you untap them for acceleration? The game designers knew that when they made that ability. Sure. But the idea to be allergic to shuffling is something for me, and that kind of met up with their desire to make some variety in the game just for whoever wants it, for whyever it's wanted, is kind of delightful to me. The sort of story of getting to that point, and then when a player plays the deck, they get the benefit of that, cosmic fist bump between me and the developers is awesome to me. I feel this is the beginning of my understanding of something that you, EyePatchNotes, and other people have kind of brought up over the past few years about how you care about something, maybe not you, EyePatchNotes, but people have said they care about a thing that's often described as like coming up with something the developers didn't intend, but it's like not that though. And I've often frustratedly pointed out that you can't even know if that's that's not real. I don't know, that you can't know if that's true. And so it must be something else. People are saying it's that, but that's not even really possible, but they are still enjoying like whatever that thing is they're referring to. And so what is it? What is the content of that thing? And I think that I enjoy a similar, maybe the same thing. I just think of it so differently that I didn't recognize it at first. And as I've been going through making these parlay with you, I feel that feeling a little bit. Like I definitely get it. The magic is real to me. That this would be a fun thing to do. I'm totally on board with why it would be fun to make a character this way. I would be quite interested at some other time to get into the idea of, I guess, like balancing for games like this, or as a game master playing into players that want to build this way, since it can be really fun and the complications that comes with. Because players have their own rules about what is and isn't not really fair, but like the rules of conduct for like figuring out something really powerful. To what extent will you play hardball or say, well, this isn't on the build's roadmap. It doesn't really have anything to do with the build, but the build doesn't have enough to gain from this slot in its decision points. So I'm just going to get something really, really good. And then it ends up being like good stuff plus a really powerful synergy. And then it's just crazy. And I'm not sure I would expect most developers, but also game masters in this case, to like really be able to keep up with that. And so what do? How do you run a game like that alongside another player that maybe has similar but not the same sensibilities, resulting in a lot of powerful builds, but they're powerful with different spirits behind them, I guess. I'm looking forward to hearing more about the completed version of this, and then perhaps we could talk about that. I hope you enjoyed this. I thought it was a lot of fun. We got to dive into like what the kind of one of the big payoffs of this build you're leading up to is. And as I said at the beginning of the parlay, hopefully this was an interesting way to look at it as like a window into how you could enjoy this kind of thing. And hopefully my description of what I see as my breakthrough about how people are maybe enjoying these builds and how I maybe feel the same way came across. I hope that was understandable. It's like a 2/3 formed thought at the moment. So I hope you'll forgive me or accept it as the A for effort that it deserves. Let's call it there for now. Looking forward to the next one.